Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 24th of June of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Sumy and Kharkiv area, and the most interesting updates, telling the truth, are coming from Sumy direction. As we can see, we have significant changes on deployment map, and according to information that we can find in the open source, the Ukrainians have redeployed the 53rd Mechanized Brigade, 31st Mechanized Brigade, 32nd Mechanized Brigade, and 67th Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. I remind you that 53rd Brigade used to be responsible for defense of southwestern part of Avdiivka direction. The 53rd was located in the vicinity of Opotna, Vodyana, Severna, Tonenka, so these fields and these fortifications were under the responsibilities of this brigade, but after the Ukrainians were defeated, this brigade was removed from the line of combat contact to restore its combat capabilities, and now we see that Ukrainians found the area that this brigade can be useful. The 767th Brigade is famous for its failure in the vicinity of Chasiv Yar. If you remember, this brigade is responsible for defeat of the Ukrainians there, and now we see the current configuration in the vicinity of Chasiv Yar. The Russian progress I'm talking about is thanks to this 67th Brigade. As I understand, the 31st Brigade and 32nd Brigade are going to be the secondary brigades for 53rd, which is the core of defense or core of offensive operation. As for 67th Brigade, as I understand, this brigade is going to be something like black detachment, or simply saying the anti-retreat forces, whose main responsibility is not to allow the other forces, the rest of brigades, to fall back from their positions during the Russian offensive operation or possible Ukrainian offensive operation, to follow the orders or something like this. So very interesting updates. As for Kharkiv direction, we have just one changes on map, and the Ukrainians have redeployed the forces of 17th Tank Brigade in the vicinity of Liptsy. So as you can see, during the previous 24-48 hours, we received significant number of updates of redeployment of mechanized and tank parts of Ukrainian forces, which is very important and very difficult to understand what exactly the Ukrainians are planning to do, to defend themselves or to begin a real offensive operation. Now let's move to the situation on the ground. We have lots of very interesting reports, and I would like to discuss with you lots of very interesting topics today. And first, let's talk about this video. The Russians are saying that in this video we can see how the Russians, after they managed to discover the positions of headquarters of the 92nd Brigade, destroyed the positions of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And the Russians reported that this happened after another wave of attack of Armed Forces of Ukraine in direction of Hlyboka. Because now the Ukrainians in every single direction, including Kharkiv, South Donetsk, and many other directions, try to use in the offensive operations just the fresh forces and recently mobilized soldiers. The Ukrainians are not sending veterans and those soldiers who've been staying on the line of combat contact for more than half a year. The Ukrainians try to use just fresh mobilized forces, and this is the main problem for the Ukrainians. Of course, on the, from the first side, the Ukrainians are able to save the lives and the personal experience. On the other hand, they're sending the fresh mobilized forces sometimes in useless attacks where obviously they would be either defeated or captured by the Russians. And in case of defeat, it's not a big problem for the Ukrainians, but in case of capturing these fresh mobilized forces can provide additional information to the Russians of positions of Ukrainian forces or command centers. And this is exactly the case. After another wave of attack, the Ukrainian soldiers were captured and they provided important information to the Russians, and then the Russians destroyed the headquarters. Almost the same situation was described by the Ukrainians on South Donetsk direction. We have very interesting post as usually from the 79th Air Assault Brigade. Today they published very interesting piece of news, and they're saying that now almost every single brigade tried to bring fresh forces to the line of combat contact, as we discussed 5 minutes ago, but they tried to close their eyes. So this is something new. We haven't seen such things in the past, past, and now the Ukrainians are trying to use this everywhere. They try to mobilize as many as possible forces, they send these soldiers to the line of combat contact, and they try to close their eyes with the purpose not to allow them, in case if they are captured by the Russians, to provide the Russians important information. So this is something like a cure that Ukrainians found to from one side to save as many as possible experienced soldiers, on the other hand to use fresh mobilized and not to give the Russians chance to discover additional information from these fresh mobilized soldiers. And something like this currently is taking place in Volchansk. For example, in this area we got report that the Ukrainians, according to information we have, near Volchansk and Chasiv Yar, refusals of Ukrainian armed forces battalions to go on to the attack are recorded. They agreed to defend but not to attack. These are posts we are receiving from all over the entire territory of Ukraine, from the line of combat contact starting in Kharkiv and ending somewhere in Kherson direction. So we see that Ukrainians suffered a very big crisis, the crisis of new generation of soldiers, fresh mobilized, who doesn't want to fight, who were mobilized forcibly, and old and experienced soldiers who've been staying on the line of combat contact for more than 6 months. And of course this conflict will be increased from day to day, and this can lead to unpredictable situation and consequences. Now let's move and discuss the line of combat contact. The most important is the geography and the configuration of Russian, let's say, FAB strikes. If you take a look at the map, you're gonna see that the Russians are bombing the Ukrainian positions along this line, and the Russians are doing this mainly with FABs of different calibers. For example, in this video we can see the use of Russian FAB 3000 and FAB 1500, and they are pretty accurate in comparison with the previous days. And the most important is that the Russians are bombing the Ukrainians very close to the line of combat contact, very close to the Russian positions. And these videos confirm that the Ukrainians are about to finish the creation or configuration of their offensive orders, let's say, states of their units. So they're about to finish, or the Ukrainians are already in the process. In this video we can see another FAB strike on the concentration of Ukrainian forces to the south of Volchansk. In this, for example, video we can see few more FAB strikes. The Russians were bombing the concentration of Ukrainian forces inside of this forest and this tree line. Another area where the Ukrainians tried to accumulate forces and to concentrate soldiers before further offensive. And the same story we can see in this forest. The Russians were bombing this territory heavily. So once again, everything is on the verge of the biggest attack or biggest offensive from the Ukrainian side. Of course, time will tell us whether the Ukrainians are able to get something or not, but the stakes were raised significantly by the United States of America, because today, according to information we have, according to the Washington, the United States expects that as a result of the NATO summit in July that is going to take place within the next few weeks, a positive decision will be made on the Ukraine's membership in the European Union State Department. So the stakes are raised by the United States of America, and even if the Ukrainians are not going to begin any offensive operation in this area, now the Russians are forced to begin something just with the purpose to ruin the Washington NATO summit and to show the Western countries and European unions that the Ukrainians don't have defense, that the Russians can capture and will capture will take as many as possible regarding any agreements, regarding any situation, any negotiations with anybody, either with the NATO countries or NATO organization or European Union. So we'll see, of course, what is going to be next. Now let's move to Volchansk. We have additional very interesting reports about the situation on the ground. Currently, the main clashes are taking place not for the citadel, not for aggregate plant, and not for the most southern part of the north of Volchansk. Currently, the main clashes are taking place for the strategical headstart located between the village by the name of Tikhe and Volchansk itself. We are talking about this territory. For now, this is the most important part of Volchansk direction. direction. The thing is that Ukrainians continue sending more and more infantry from the southern part in the northern direction, and this is the reason we got report that near Volchansk and Chasiv Yar refusals of Ukraine armed forces battalions to go on the attack are recorded, because the Ukrainians are forced to operate in the north of Volchansk without support of armored vehicles and tanks. They need to operate just under cover of FPV drones against the Russian, let's say, armored vehicles and personnel carriers and tanks. And of course, it is very difficult. And so that's why the Ukrainians are trying to attack these strategical heights. And this is very important, because who controls this territory that is already under Russian control controls the main supply road that goes from Volchansk to Tikha itself. We are talking about this supply road. And if the Ukrainians are able to restore control over this territory, then the Ukrainians will be able to start sending significant number of armored vehicles, tanks, personnel carriers from, let's say, eastern part of Volchansk front line inside of the city itself, and to begin fighting with the Russians. Until the Russians control this territory, the Ukrainians have no chances to do this. And the problem is that these hills can be attacked and can be stormed by the Ukrainians just from the city itself, because due to the geographical configuration and differences in layers of the surface. So the Ukrainians can do this just from this area, and while the ground infantry forces without any support are doing this, the Ukrainians are trying to concentrate their forces in the vicinity of village by the name of Tikha. The Russians, of course, see everything, and the Russians are bombing this territory heavily with tall flamethrower systems, and of course with the use of FAB 250, FAB 500, and even bigger, let's say, calibers. As for the eastern Volchansk, the Ukrainians, regarding the fire of the Russian forces, regarding the desperate clashes, the Ukrainians managed to improve their positions, and as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians captured these streets like Gorkova Street, Amosova Street, and some part of Khlibarobova Street. So the video was published by the Lutz Assault Brigade of how the Ukrainian soldiers were clearing the basements, the buildings, the residential area in this part of Volchansk. And based on this video, we have adjusted the map and returned this part of Volchansk under complete Ukrainian control. So very interesting situation continuing developing in this area. And once again, if the Ukrainians are able to restore control over this strategical position, then only then the main battle for Volchansk is going to start, because after that the Ukrainians will send significant number of armored vehicles inside of the town itself, and then there are going to be real clashes begin between Russians and Ukrainian soldiers. Now let's move further, and we are going to Kupiansk area. We have very important updates, and the most important updates is coming from the southern Kupiansk direction, more precisely from the soldiers of the 12th Special Purpose Brigade Azov. Today they published a very big letter about the situation on the ground, about the situation with Ukrainian commanders, and about the situation with Ukrainian generals. And the Ukrainians are saying that since the beginning of the special military operation, the general by the name of Sokol, he is the head of this tactical group, not just of the forces of Azov Brigade, but of this entire direction. He is responsible, and according to the soldiers of 12th Azov Brigade, this Ukrainian general, killed more Ukrainians than the Russians did in this direction, as a result of useless and sometimes not very smart offensive operations from the Ukrainian side. It's a very interesting post, because this post was published by the Ukrainians at the same time when the Russians published significant number of videos from Kreminna, from Tarskoye and Zarychna itself, and a lot of videos were how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian supply roads and pontoon bridges. So I don't think that this is something like consequences. I think that everything is connected, and most likely the soldiers of 12th Brigade expect the beginning of Russian attack in this direction as well, and that the Ukrainians understand that they are no longer available or able to stop the Russians or to slow them down in this area. So we'll see, of course, what is going to be next. Now let's move to Sivers's direction. We have very important update from the village by the name of Razdolovka. The Russian soldiers raised the first flag inside of the village, which confirmed confirms some control over some part of the territory. As you can see, the Russian soldier while moving through the ruins of the building was very careful, because he understands that there are a lot of Ukrainian soldiers around, so that the territory wasn't cleared yet completely. So that's why he was very careful, and which confirms that there are still very heavy clashes in the central part. But this video was published yesterday in the evening, so I believe that during the previous 24 hours the Russians managed to improve their positions, and probably the central part is already in the gray zone. Now let's move further in Chasiv Yar direction. We haven't received lots of updates. The only thing we know for sure that the Russians began the ground operation in direction of the Chasiv Yar citadel. Today we got just one video of how the Russian stormtroopers and Russian soldiers were storming the first buildings in this line. So as you can see, one building was heavily damaged, and the Russian stormtroopers start moving in this direction. So the Russian soldiers were here, and as a result of that video, the Russians managed to improve their positions in this direction. So we don't know for sure how exactly this video ended, but we see the vectors of Russian movements, and that most likely the battle for the final stronghold has started. As for the area in the vicinity of Toretsk, during the previous days we got a lot of videos from this area, but during the previous 48 hours we haven't received almost anything. Right before I start making the video, we got report and geolocated confirmation of Russian control over this pump station. The video was geolocated with coordinates, with dates and so on. We will adjust the map before the next video, and we will adjust and we'll talk about this episode during the next let's say report. So the most important that we received some confirmations of Russian progress, yet we haven't received any confirmation of Russian control over Sumy or these landfills, but at least we received confirmation of control over this pulp station. Now let's move to Avdiivka area. We have lots of updates, and of course the most important is that the Russians captured the village of Novoalexandrovka completely. This information was confirmed by different sources, including pro-Ukrainian deep state. In this video we can see how the Russian soldiers were moving in the village from one position to another under very heavy fire of Ukrainian FPV drones and artillery. This is Russian soldier who was moving, let's say, on the most southwestern part of the village. Also, we have reports from mappers that the territory was completely under control. And we have fire anomalies in Vozdvizhenka itself. The Russians are bombing this territory heavily, probably preparing the foothold before further offensive in this direction. According to updates that we received during the previous days, the Russians have already entered this network of the fortifications, but for now without any confirmation from anybody about this. As for Sokol, the Russians captured the most northern part, the central part, the eastern part. Maybe there are still Ukrainian positions in the most western part. We don't know for sure, but we know for sure that the Russians are moving further and further its focus to the west. In this video we can see how the Russians were bombing this territory. Not the northern part, not Sokol itself, but already the village by the name of Yevgeniivka. Novosilovka Persha, the Russians still haven't started any offensive on the ground. Just, let's say, preparation activity with significant number of FPV drone strikes on more and more Ukrainian armored vehicles who are moving from one side into another. In this video, for example, we can see another Ukrainian Bradley who was trying to evacuate from the area, but was probably damaged by the Russian FPV drone. As for Krasnogorovka, we got lots of very interesting updates. The Russians managed to improve their positions and to capture a few more areas and buildings in these settlements and town, getting closer and closer to the most northern and northern part of the stronghold. And also, according to 79th Brigade, according to Ukrainian expert, this town will be lost by the Ukrainians in the very, very near future. And once again, according to the same 79th Brigade, the Ukrainians are sending significant number of reinforcements in this direction from newly just recently mobilized soldiers, and they close their eyes because they understand that these soldiers are not reliable. These soldiers don't want to die, they don't want to fight, and if they have possibilities to surrender, the Ukrainians understand that they will surrender as soon as possible. And if they surrender, there are very high chances and risk that these soldiers will provide the Russians additional information about the command centers and the headquarters of the Ukrainian army. So once again, the situation in the Ukrainian army is very difficult. Now the Ukrainians try to save the core of Ukraine army, those who've been fighting with the Russians for a very long time, because these soldiers are highly motivated and they will never, let's say, join Russian army, or they will never, how to say, be betrayals to Ukraine. And this is the first group, and this is not very big group, because maybe few 100,000 soldiers. And now we have another group of Ukrainians who was recently mobilized, and they don't want to fight because most of them were mobilized during those crazy videos that have been receiving from the entire territory of Ukraine almost every single day. These guys don't want to fight for Ukraine. They don't want to surrender and return back home, and maybe even to start fighting with Zelensky and the current power in Kiev. Nobody knows about this. Nobody have the real answer to this question. As for South Donetsk direction, we have additional progress of the armed force of Russian Federation towards the main supply road 0524. We got different mappers update, like pro-Ukrainian and neutral mappers. As for Velika Novosilovka, we haven't received anything important. Very interesting videos we continue receiving from Prichistovka, another FAB arrival in this area. As a result of strike, some headquarters or temporary position of armed forces of Ukraine was destroyed. And also we have another Lemur video from the same area, and I'm showing you these videos because since the beginning of June we got significant number of geolocations from this village itself, which confirms that maybe the Russians are preparing the territory before, let's say, some offensive in this direction. Let's take a look at the number of updates since the beginning of months. A lot of strike, as you can see, for a small village of 3 streets. Now let's move further. As for Robotina, we haven't received anything important, and we continue receiving significant number of updates from Kamyanskaya direction. The Ukrainians, if you remember, according to information from the open sources, the Ukrainians are planning to begin offensive in 2 directions. The first one in Kharkiv and the second one in direction of Energodar on the line Kamyanskaya, Vasilievka, Energodar. So based on the videos of FABs in Kharkiv, we made the conclusion that Ukrainians have already created the offensive configuration. They have concentrated the forces along the line of combat contact, and they're just waiting for an order from maybe United States of America or from Kiev military authorities. And the same situation we can see in this direction. The Ukrainians also are already in, let's say, offensive state, offensive configuration. They have concentrated the critical mass, and the Ukrainians are about to begin its offensive. So that's why the Russians are trying to bomb them with soft flamethrower systems and with FABs. As for Kherson direction, during the previous 24 hours, we got few important videos. In this video, we can see how the Russians managed to discover another Ukraine IRIS-T air defense system, and as a result of Russian strike, the system was destroyed. From the same area, we got lots of videos, and we continue receiving the videos of ATACMS missile strike of Ukraine forces towards Crimea, and very significant video, obviously. And as a result of that strike, according to Russian sources, Ukrainian sources, the Ukrainians were trying to hit military base in Crimea. We have the video of consequences of fire anomalies in the area. The video was published by the Russian civilians in Crimea, and we have satellite pictures of the consequences of attack. This is the base before attack, and this is the base after. Obviously, based on these photos, we can make a conclusion that more than 30% of this base was damaged, and was damaged not just by missile strike but also by fire. During the day, the NATO and United States Global Hawks were flying in the southwestern part of the Black Sea, conducting reconnaissance operation and collecting as much as possible information for the Ukrainian missile launchers. Most likely, the upcoming night, the United States of America and Ukraine and NATO countries are going to make another attack on Crimea, and of course, this is done before the NATO summit in Washington and before possible beginning of Ukraine operation. The Russians also tried to discover the Ukrainian positions, and as a result of reconnaissance operation, the Russians discovered a very big warehouse in Odessa, and as a result of counter-strike, the warehouse was destroyed. Most likely, the Ukrainians were keeping or collecting their missiles or maybe Navy drones. -1 ammo depot, as we can see. Important statements are coming from Hungary, according to information we have. According to the statement of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Hungary, sending military instructors from European Union countries to Ukraine will be the first step to sending regular troops there. So this is going to happen, obviously, but this is going to happen based on the results of Ukrainian offensive operation that is going to take place very soon. And of course, also based on the events and statements that are going to take place during the Washington NATO summit. And once again, the United States of America expected a positive decision on the Ukrainians' membership in the European Union. Very important months is in ahead of us, and we see that neither Russians nor the Ukrainians have chances to start peaceful agreements. The stakes are raised, and let's see what is going to be next. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel. Put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.